Thank you all for being with us here this morning for our presentation on climate and COVID, 20 lessons for responding to crisis. My name is Erin Perry, and I am currently a student working with Tennessee Interfaith Power Light. And this morning, our presentation has been created by Dr. Dan Joranko, who is both the coordinator of the UMC Tennessee Conference Creation Care Ministry and Tennessee Interfaith Power Light. And the presentation will be followed with a response by Dr. Michael Black, and then concluding with a Q&A session. So if at any time during our session this morning you have any questions, there is a chat box at the bottom of your screen. So you just click on the chat button and then type your question there, and we will read it at the end as a part of the Q&A session. The other thing that I want to remind y'all of is to keep the sound as focused on the presentation as possible. I'll ask everyone but Dan to mute their microphones, and you can do that by clicking the mute button in the bottom left corner of your screen. And that is just so that Dan's audio will be the most heard throughout the presentation. So before I turn it over to Dan, I just wanted to say a little bit more about our speakers this morning as means of introduction. Like I mentioned earlier, our first speaker will be Dan Joranko, who is the coordinator of Tennessee Interfaith Power Light and the UMC Tennessee Conference Creation Care Ministry. Dan has a PhD in resource development from Michigan State University and a Master's of Divinity from Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. So big thanks to Dan for his research and all the work that he put into this presentation today. Our second speaker today will be Michael Black. Michael teaches sustainability and works for a more equitable and livable future as a faculty member in the Neuroscience Institute at Georgia State University, which is a Global Ministries, he is a Global Ministries United Methodist Earthkeeper and a member of Decatur First UMC. So thanks to both of y'all for being here this morning. And so just one final reminder to try and stay muted throughout the entire meeting, and to send any questions in the chat box. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dan.
What about, you want to introduce Matthew?
Oh, is Matthew speaking this morning as well?
Yes.
Oh, I had no idea. Well, Matthew Groves is a graduate of Vanderbilt Divinity School, and he will also be presenting this morning. Sorry, Matthew. So thank you for being here this morning as well. He also works with the Young Evangelicals for Climate Change. So thank you, Matthew, for being here.
Okay, as Erin mentioned, this will be recorded and will be sent out to you, and we will also send you the slides, so you don't have to feel the need to take extensive notes. This is a bit of a complex presentation, and it's always a bit of a challenge to present over Zoom. It's not my usual way of presenting. And so your patience is always appreciated in presenting a complex presentation over Zoom, but I'll try to do the best I can. I'll start out with an overview, and then I'll go through the 20 lessons. And right now my screen, there we go, my screen is moving. So 20 lessons on climate change and the coronavirus crisis. Living and learning through one similar crisis, this coronavirus crisis, may make us more open and able to address a similar crisis, I think in many ways, which is our climate crisis. Pestilence or disease and climate change are actually ancient human problems. We've become much better at addressing disease in the last century, but our climate change problem is getting worse. Both of these crises have been triggered by human interaction with the non-human world, and this is a new aspect for climate that we're triggering that anthropogenically. Both are crises of the commons, with multidimensional aspects and need to be understood with systems thinking, including nonlinear effects. Both, interestingly enough, involve flattening and then suppressing the curve. Of course, the curve of the coronavirus and the curve of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly CO2. Both have invisible aspects which make them difficult to grasp and deal with. Both have major public health aspects and in many ways can be understood similarly as public health problems. Both have major economic implications. The long-term health of the economy depends on effectively addressing both crises. Both involve mitigation, or essentially suppressing the problem, and adaptation, living through the problem. Both tend to reveal and exacerbate major systematic social inequalities, and I'll talk about that at length later in the session. And there's one important difference. Immediate solutions to the climate crisis often have economic benefits, particularly in job creation, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. With the coronavirus, addressing it largely has negative economic implications in the short term. Another difference is that the climate crisis is a bit slower moving, so there is less sense of immediacy, although there is an urgency to it, but also some more time to respond in a just and sustainable manner. Our responses to both crises have been partial and often dysfunctional, particularly in the United States. Many countries have demonstrated an effective response. And I think one of the reasons, there's several reasons for our dysfunctional response, but one of them is demagoguery. A demagogue essentially is a self-styled populist who often expresses some genuinely popular themes. But a demagogue plays to social resentments. Resentments are different than grievances, which have a very tangible reason for perhaps a social injustice. But resentments tend to be emotional and build over time. Though grievances, if not addressed, can lead to resentments. Importantly, demagogues tend to scapegoat vulnerable populations. Also, propaganda plays to emotions while disregarding evidence. And demagogues tend to disregard demographic norms. Our demagoguery problem is not limited to one person in the United States. I believe too much of our media has been given over to essentially demagogues for almost 40 years, and it's a growing problem. And social media perhaps even exacerbates that too. So we've had a bit of a dysfunctional response to coronavirus in the United States, and also I believe to climate change. The first lesson, but before we actually get to the first lesson, let's look at these two slides. First of all, the State of the Unions. You see in the blue there, that's the European Union. There are many ways our peer countries. They were slow to respond to the coronavirus. And so we are basically about the same place at the beginning, late March. But you see that the European Union has now responded fairly effectively, and they have a much smaller amount of cases. And the United States, the cases continue to grow. And this is at the end of June. And actually the problem has gotten worse in the United States since the end of June. Also, with the climate crisis, you see since 1960, the amount of atmospheric CO2 being measured, and that curve continues just to rise with very little flattening in the curve. The first lesson, lesson number one, is listen to science. Some of us in Nashville participated in a very large March for Science about 3 years ago. We've been putting this message out there, but we haven't been particularly listening to science recently in the United States. The science is clear on the basic problem of climate change. And we also have a lot of knowledge about pandemics. The science of pandemics is fairly well developed. With both crises and in science as a whole, there's always probabilities and uncertainties involved. And so there's relative certainties of, again, about climate. The basic problem we're as certain as science gets, or as human knowledge gets. But there's also uncertainties. We're not sure quite where it's going. We have some probability assessments with the COVID crisis. We're not exactly sure where it's going or how the virus works, but we're gaining more knowledge about it. We probably think we're going to get a vaccine, but that's not absolutely known. Interestingly enough, the United States is probably the only country where college-educated adults routinely dismiss science. That's, of course, not all college-educated adults, but we have a fair percentage who do for political reasons. And we neglect science at our peril. Lesson 2 is act early and decisively in the face of a crisis. Time is of the essence. We had a short window to stop both crises in their tracks. We're probably beyond we're well beyond stopping the COVID crisis in its tracks, and we're probably beyond just completely suppressing the climate problem. So we'll also need to adapt. Some countries responded to the pandemic early and effectively. Some examples are South Korea, New Zealand, Vietnam, and Paraguay. They're all good examples from quite differing cultures. We missed the initial opportunity to suppress the coronavirus, to manage it at a relatively safe level. For instance, the office focused on pandemic response. The Pandemic Preparedness Office of the National Security Council was closed in 2018. Which made it difficult for us to respond quickly. We should have put together a high-level task force from the very beginning and at a presidential level, and that can help actually cut through some bureaucratic tendencies, like there was some problems with the early test kits, and at a presidential level, you can work through some of that. Although some of those, again, those rules are there for good reasons. But in some emergencies, one can cut through things. And also a high-level task force would perhaps be useful in the climate crisis. There's a lot that can be done in adaptation planning. For instance, in the COVID crisis, personal protective gear could have been manufactured quickly. Plans for hospitals, ventilators, plans for nursing homes, prisons, packing houses. We could have put together a national food distribution network or addressed that, and food pantries. We could have alerted the need to manufacture more hand sanitizer and just simple things like toilet paper and gloves. We didn't get to that. Then there's key leverage points and the middle mitigation for the COVID crisis: testing, contract tracing, and lockdowns, travel restrictions, plans for vulnerable places, developing treatments. Again, we've been slow and often ineffective in our efforts in this way. Our opening, we should coordinate our opening of the economy, a coordinated plan based on science. We've had a number of early reopenings, and then the late stages, we would, vaccines and antibody testing. Also, it's important to have a national plan for both. We don't have a national plan on the COVID crisis, and we're trying to deal with it state by state. And again, with the climate crisis, municipalities, states can lead the way, but they can't solve the problem. You need a national plan. The window to suppress carbon at a relatively safe level is rapidly closing. We've missed some opportunities. We knew about the crisis in the 1980s, and perhaps a carbon tax and some research and development plans could have gone a great way to not having a crisis, or at least one that we can manage. The first Bush administration was interesting at addressing the crisis, and then they pulled back. The Kyoto Accords were put together, and then never signed by the United States. The Clinton administration was working to get a carbon tax, but was unable to get legislation in Congress. And then we started to act at the US and the national level on the Paris Climate Accords and the Clean Power Plan, but we were withdrawing from both. And then we also need, of course, adaptation plans, resilience plans for our coastlines, ways to deal with heat islands, weatherizing lower income homes, preparing for climate refugees, and dealing with temperature zone shifts in agriculture. But the good news is that we can still pivot rapidly in these middle stages. The European Union showed the ability to pivot rapidly in the COVID crisis, and I believe we can still do so in the climate crisis. But we need to embrace and coordinate around key leverage point strategies. So again, we need to act early and decisively in the face of a crisis. Lesson 3, competent public institutions are critical. To protect the commons, you need competent institutions with adequate regulatory authority and resources. The CDC is critical to address pandemics. It's been the premier public health agency in the world, but has recently been underfunded, undermined, and politicized. Its response to the COVID crisis has been mixed at best. The EPA is crucial to address the climate crisis, but it has also been underfunded, undermined, and politicized recently. For example, the EPA has gutted much of its climate information from its website. And the current administration has curtailed over 100 regulations which regulate and protect clean air and water. Ideology can very much weaken and distort institutional capacity and partisanship. So again, public institutions need the resources to address the problems, and they need to follow professional best practices. And they need to be insulated enough from partisan politics so they can follow the evidence and make the hard choices that may cut across political needs and partisan bases. And so lesson 3 is that we need competent public institutions. Lesson 4, the environment plays a key role in health and impact. Both the pandemic and the climate affect health directly. Some examples, deforestation impacts both climate change and the spread of diseases. 6 out of every 10 and 3/4 of the world's emerging diseases are, 6 out of every 10 of the existing diseases and 3/4 of the world's emerging diseases are what are called zootonic. They're spread from animals to humans. Proximity to wild animals through deforestation leads to significant increases in zootonic diseases. And of course, cutting down the forest around the world and the jungles around the world exacerbates the climate crisis extensively. Local environments impact the extent of health disparities and pandemics, air quality or the built environment, housing, availability to food. 80% of African Americans live in neighborhoods with poor air quality, and this obviously affects asthma and other respiratory problems, which is a major problem in this pandemic. Local environments also impact the extent of health disparities due to climate change, air quality, heat islands, housing again. People of color are twice as likely to suffer from extreme heat days. And so, again, it exacerbates, the local environment exacerbates social inequalities. But also local environments can be restored with help mitigate the potential pandemics and climate change. You can weatherize homes, you can restore forests, you can do things to help lessen the problem of heat islands. And so again, the environment plays a key role in health and impact, and there's many more examples than I've just given. Lesson 5, protecting the common good transcends ideology and partisanship. Protecting the safety and well-being of members of society is a basic function of governance. Interestingly, the Bush and Obama pandemic playbooks were essentially the same in most respects. The Bush administration was quite effective in dealing with the H1N1 flu pandemic. And so again, dealing with these kind of major crises should transcend ideology and partisanship. But we're seeing that not happen, again, largely due to ideology and partisanship. And even worse, our democratic institutions are increasingly flawed. In fact, the world rankings now rank the United States as a flawed democracy. We can rebuild that, but our ability to respond to the common good has been weakened considerably over the last 30 or 40 years. The sixth lesson is that international cooperation is essential. There were missed opportunities for decisive international cooperation in the current pandemic. If we had much more coordinated, for instance, around travel bans, they would have been much more effective. We've downgraded the World Health Organization, which is critical for addressing pandemics. There's plenty of opportunities for vaccine cooperation, and again, opportunities to the World Health Organization. And international cooperation is essential to fulfill the promise of the Climate Paris Accords. As important as the United States is, our carbon output is less than 15% of the world output. We can't solve this on our own. So international cooperation is essential to dealing with these crises. Lesson 7, the United States and China play central roles. Both are great powers which play a central role in addressing both the pandemic and the climate crisis. They're the two leading emitters of carbon emissions. And in the pandemic, cooperation broke down between the two. We had been strong in terms of public health cooperation. The United States actually helped build much of China's public health infrastructure. But that's broken down in recent years. We had CDC observer positions in Wuhan, which would have been very helpful. We did not fill those positions. And actually very close cooperation at the very beginning might have contained the pandemic. Respiratory diseases are very difficult to contain, so it's not absolutely sure whether we could have contained it, but we had an opportunity in the early days. And close cooperation is essential for negotiating long-term climate accords and policies. And possibly there's a real possibility in terms of cooperation around renewable energies and closing coal plants. And so there's a lot of opportunity for cooperation between the two, and they play a critical role. Lesson number 8, clear and consistent communication is crucial. We need a shared understanding. That doesn't mean there's going to be some differences in opinion about various pieces, but we do need a shared understanding to address problems of the commons. We can't just deny that climate's a problem. We can't think the COVID problem's a hoax. You need some shared understanding to address problems of the common. And you need to be scientists. Public health science is a challenging one because scientists are always uncertain about certain things, but as much as possible to be clear about what's certain, what's probable, and what's still uncertain about these things, just be honest about it. And that goes a great way towards restoring public trust in science communications. Guidance in the COVID crisis has been muddled, and not because of the gentleman before you, but for many other reasons. And also we've just been really dependent on episodic and uneven news and internet sources with a lot of mixed messages from government leaders. There's been exceptional coverage out there. The Atlantic has been exceptional. I read the New York Times pieces often on it too. and they've been very clear. So if you want some clear sources, those would be two I would suggest. Despite exceptional presentations, the public health understanding is also gathered from episodic and uneven and sometimes deceiving news and internet sources. So our public science communication needs to step up and send clear messages and also be clear and honest about uncertainties, probability, and uncertainties. From the very beginning of the COVID crisis, we probably should have had a presidential address with a CDC presentation right afterwards. It would have gone a great way. And at the presidential level too, on the climate crisis and restoring our public institutions to communicate on this. Also, alarms can be helpful in alerting us to a crisis, but we also need calm messaging to avoid panic and assure a measured and reasoned response. So there's that tension between urgency and alarm, but also, just being calm and consistent about our communication. And finally, just a point, this is my own point, I think actually handbooks are helpful. That sometimes just printed materials, particularly for certain populations, can be very useful. And just having one source that you can kind of go to for clear things. Websites are very helpful if you know how to utilize them properly. But also you get lost in a lot of information. Even those who know how to navigate information often get lost in a lot of information. So we need to kind of simplify our information and get it out there in clear ways. So clear and consistent communication is crucial. Point 9, denial can take on varied forms and dimensions. One, as it says, it's not happening. We can simply deny the problem, which has tended to be, I don't like to use the word conservative because I think that conservatives can often be very good on certain things, but to the kind of the right of our political center, there's been a problem of denial out there. We can deny the severity of the problem, which has tended to be a little bit of a problem to the left of center. Yes, there's a problem there, but it's not that bad. We don't have to move as quickly on it. We don't need to address it as quickly and there's economic costs to it, and you just kind of throw up your hands. Institutional and corporate interests can lead to denial, Exxon being the worst example. Our car companies they admit there's a problem of climate change, but there's a lot of economic interest in selling large SUVs. And so car companies are kind of in the middle there. And universities, who I often work for, institutional with the COVID crisis. I'm not going to say when we should open up or not. That's above my pay grade and knowledge. But I've noticed sometimes it's happening, but it's not that bad. We don't need to address it, kind of thing. And we can also deny because our solutions do not fit our predominant political and economic values. It's kind of solution aversion. But I also want to say that the first two forms of denial are not equivalent. Though many deny the severity of the pandemic early, including much of Europe, there's also the potential for a more reasoned mitigation and adaptation response once a crisis is faced. You can't face a crisis when you're just simply denying it. And in the European case, there was a rapid response that flattened the curve. So again, denial can take on varied forms and dimensions. 10, we are all in this together. An effective response to a crisis of the commons depends on everyone pulling together. Leaving responses up to the individual choice is grossly inadequate to the scope and the nature of the two crises. As I said earlier, we need a national plan for both the pandemic and climate. Localities can help lead, but not solve the problem. I like to say that harmony is diverse voices joining together in song. And addressing problems of the commons, we need both a shared understanding and respect for diverse voices to understand complexities and to design effective and nuanced solutions. So we're all in this together. But also some are more vulnerable than others, peoples, groups, and organizations and places. So we need to recognize both 10 and 11. There's a little bit of a tension between the two, but we need both hands to effectively row the boat, as it were. We're in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. I've heard that said, but I also had some problems with how that was said. Because if we're all just in the same boat, in different boats, then we can just all row separately. So I think we also need to coordinate as a fleet. Otherwise, small boats may be swamped and large boats may suffer crashes and sink. And so that's also the case. We need to coordinate as a fleet. And finally, we may need to remember that fleets are able to build and include better and different boats. And that's that social justice piece moving forward. And so we're all in the same storm, we're not in the same boat, but we need to coordinate as a fleet, and we need to build some better boats, particularly those that are leaky. Again, there's difference in vulnerabilities. For the pandemic crisis, I'll spend the most time there: health, exposure, economic, and social. The United States has a long history of indifference to suffering of the socially weak and different. Conquest of the Americas involved a major epidemic and widespread enslavement. And so, at least amongst portions of our population, we look at people as being disposable and places as being disposable. So we have to recognize that's part of our history, and it continues to exacerbate problems. Vulnerabilities in terms of the pandemic, mortality. This is actually exposure. So mortality, if you have a chronic condition, you're 12 times more likely. Blacks and Latinos are about twice as, or 3 times as likely to die. And that's due to socioeconomic conditions, not lifestyle. It's multi-factor. And the elderly are the most vulnerable. Over 80% of people who pass away are elderly. And interestingly enough, it's about twice as fatal for men. Men have a public health crisis out there too for various reasons. Exposure, this shows the difference in exposure rates. And you notice that it's quite extremely more for people of color. And people, what I call our urban and suburban gentry, about 30% of people can work at home safely. And if you're working at home, you're not necessarily part of that gentry. But again, there's a group of people who have very limited exposure because of the ability to work at home. Healthcare workers, and these are often solid middle income social service, they're about twice as likely to they're much more likely to test positive. And actually about 8 times as likely to test positive. And essential workers about twice as likely to test positive. And again, these are the death rates, again, higher for the Black share of the population. So again, exposure by race, class can exacerbate, and also local health conditions and even neighborhood conditions can contribute to, once you get sick, higher rates of mortality. The third vulnerability is economic livelihood. Smaller businesses, smaller churches and houses of worship and places of spiritual practice are affected highly by this. Smaller colleges. It's estimated 44% of business closures will be permanent. And those who live in precarity already with limited savings suffer from evictions, possible utility shutoffs, and healthcare problems. And we've also lost about 600,000 clean energy jobs during the pandemic. And finally, social vulnerabilities. The loneliness that the elderly often suffer, particularly those in nursing homes. Women with children are very stressed during the pandemic. Many have one or more of these vulnerabilities, and so it really adds up, largely due to social inequalities or social neglect. And so there's a range of vulnerabilities out there that we need to address. And again, a vulnerability of children missing school. That's another social vulnerability. The fact that we can't take care of our children right now properly and is a huge problem. Finally, the social economic conditions are similar in climate and COVID: poor housing, lack of quality food, lack of healthcare resources, lack of adequate transportation, poor local air quality, toxins in the local environment, sanitation and hygiene, access to clean water, stress due to precarious employment, bleak environments, and chronic racial prejudice all add up to these vulnerabilities. And then there's major geographic vulnerabilities around the world. In the climate crisis, coastlands and the global south will suffer the most. Bangladesh could get flooded. It's probably the world's poorest country. And the urgency of sub-Saharan Africa, and actually all of Africa around this, is just an extremely urgent problem, the climate crisis. Lesson 12 is on the positive side. We have the capacity to cooperate for the common good. In the pandemic, when we do stay in place, we do social distance, when we do wear masks, they've demonstrated effectiveness when consistently practiced. And interestingly, 80% of people in the United States regularly wear masks, and this is actually a higher rate than France or Canada. But the 20% who don't also tend to like to gather a lot, and many of them are just kind of flaunting this. And so we do have the capacity to cooperate for the common good, and I believe this is true also with the climate crisis. Number 13, all sectors of society contribute. They all need to contribute: the political systems, the economic systems, and our social systems, our government, our business, our community-based organizations, our civil society, all need to cooperate. And also we've seen that people in all walks of life have responded effectively to the pandemic. We've got a lot of community-based examples of that. We've seen effective governmental responses. And again, we've seen businesses step up and require masks in their stores. We've seen community-based organizations step up around the pandemic. And I believe that people in all walks of life can respond to the climate crisis. If you're not familiar with Project Drawdown, it gives the 100 most effective responses to climate change. And it runs across the entire spectrum of society. Everyone can contribute. And so all sectors of society contribute. Number 14, we're learning that needs and wants are not the same. The pandemic has really refocused many of us on our needs, what's essential to us. We all have a range of needs which are essential for physical and psychological and social health. They're not all just physical. I've often said, at least this is a need of mine, I need music to stay healthy. But also needs and wants merge to a degree in finding enjoyment and meeting needs. Needs can quickly sort of become wants. They can escalate to status markers or luxuries. And so, things that we don't, we might need a particular type of thing, but we find a really expensive way to meet that need, and that becomes a want. And we can easily be distracted by wants, and a clear example of the wants right now in the pandemic is going to a crowded bar. It's just not something that we need under these circumstances. And so, again, people who own those places need to be taken care of economically, but we don't need people crowding in those types of places. And sufficiency is a good term for addressing needs. Is it sufficient to address our need? And in the climate crisis, we're going to need a conversation around this too. What kind of food do we need? What kind of travel do we need? Those are very important conversations. So needs and wants are not the same. Needs tend to be undervalued in our economy, and wants tend to be overvalued in our economy. Again, the pandemic has refocused us on essential workers, those who provide for our needs. But many of these essential workers are low paid and low status in our current economy. Just one example given from Emily Stewart. There are more than 3 million health and personal care aides across the country, the vast majority of whom are women, and more than half are women of color. They take care of the elderly and disabled in their homes and in community settings, and right now these people are we're leaning on these people more than ever, but they're not receiving a lot of money. The average hourly wage for this critical group is $12.71 per hour. And so we need to take care of our essential workers better in our economy. And many who provide less essential goods are highly paid and high status. Think of our celebrities and the money that they rake in. And just remember that essential workers are taking care of us. Are we taking care of them? Number 16, and this is one of the most important points, understanding and marshaling social dynamics is critical for success in dealing with the crisis of the common. We can't simply shout out solutions from the rooftops, and we can't simply shout at each other. And we climate activists tend to do a little bit of both. And so, again, we need to understand social dynamics and how people shift and how societies shift. And it's extremely important to understand it. And that's complex, and but we need to gain a greater understanding of that. And addressing both crises depends on social support and cooperation. One of the effective things is that we need to make it as barrier-free and beneficial as possible to participate in solutions. Think of testing. You know, we don't have real long lines here in Nashville. Around the country, you know, there's nightmare scenarios out there. That's a barrier to a solution. And then the tests come back 2 weeks late. And so they're not particularly beneficial. So why would you participate in the solution? And that's often true of renewable energy or energy efficiency programs. We set up all sorts of barriers around them, and people don't participate. Another social dynamic piece is that effective causes will often have a mobilized minority. That's particularly true of the climate movement, which is growing. We need to move the moderate majority on this. That's just not appealing to what they're currently thinking, but you need to move the moderate majority. And then there's a diffusive, then there's a reactive minority out there, and we need to learn how to diffuse that effectively and with care. And also we need to address social inequalities, particularly the racial divide. It's not a luxury to address it. It's essential to addressing both crises. So understanding and marshaling social dynamics is critical for success. Number 17, to establish trust and effectiveness, there needs to be a dialogue between empirical expertise and local cultural experiences. Trusted messengers are critical. You tend to listen to people you trust, not so much the message, but you listen to people that you trust, and that's critical in both crises. And when addressing a crisis locally, you need to use the professional expertise, which often have experiences about measurables, about what's happening, about certain practices that can be effective, but you also need to listen to local cultural experiences, which often have a great deal of wisdom about implementing effective programs. And that's been shown in public health, demonstrated in public health over the last 40 years, and it's certainly a key piece in local community development, particularly in terms of climate. A good example is that in terms of Detroit. You know, they got the idea of planting, giving out free trees, but for various cultural reasons, there was a lot of resistance to that program. And so getting people involved in the program from the very beginning and actually suggesting the solutions. Maybe giving out trees is not the, the best solution. What is the best solution involving local people? But then matching that with the science in terms of, we need to do this, but this is also going to have an effect. And so a dialogue between the two is critical there. Lesson 18, to establish trust and effectiveness in any transition, real economic support is essential for those impacted most. In the pandemic, the U.S. has provided only limited and erratic support to those most economically affected. In fact, we're debating whether to even, keep these unemployment benefits. I mean, that's unbelievable in my mind. Jobless workers outrank open positions 4-to-1. So it's really fear causing people not to go back to work. We don't need to force them to go back to work. And we're currently only providing limited economic support for those affected by the transition to fossil fuels to renewables. Think our coal country. We often talk a good game there, but we don't. We're not really addressing that. And my father comes out of coal country. My grandfather was a coal miner. And in fact, I watched a movie last night. If you haven't seen October Sky, it's probably the best movie about coal country I've ever seen. So take a look at that. And it has a science piece to it too. So it's a nice piece for our presentation. And I rewatched it last night. It just happened to be free on demand. Number 19, efficiency is not equivalent to sufficiency. We're finding many of us kind of like Zoom. It can be helpful. We need to address the digital divide, but we also need to address that we're social beings. No one wants to live in a digital cage. Many of us value solitude, but we also value social ties. And some of us are suffering from what's called touch starvation and the joy of personal relationships. So efficiency is not equivalent to sufficiency. Digital technology is really good for bridging social capital. I'm talking to people across the country right now. Wide relationships that can open up. But it's less effective in bonding capital, the really tight ties that are necessary both for social movements and also for resilience in a crisis. I can't depend on somebody across the country. I need somebody close I can trust. And so face-to-face relationships are crucial in building movements and bonding people together and developing the deep and necessary bonds. And also low-income communities are currently difficult to interact with. I had a low-income energy task force. I have no way of meeting with them right now. And so that's a challenge. So just consider the interplay between efficiency and sufficiency. Another example from the pandemic, we were too efficient with our hospitals. We got down to bare bones and we don't have the beds sometimes and the ventilators sometimes. And so resilience has some extra things often built into it. And our final lesson, if we learn wisdom through the crisis, we can come out of this with a better society for all. It doesn't mean this crisis was good, but again, if you do have a crisis, and the Hebrew scriptures teach us that over and over, you can come out of it wiser and with a better wisdom and ability to care for all. And these crises may enable us to question our cognitive dissonance in terms of denial around science, but also, it's a bit of we're learning slowly that we do need shared understandings, we do need shared responses. And so out of this crisis, this COVID crisis may help us to address the climate crisis. And we may also, live better lives and come up with better solutions for our daily lives together and our joint lives together. Renewable energy ultimately is better than fossil fuels. And so these crises can help us get to a better society. but that doesn't mean that the crisis, you know, we shouldn't have had to go through the crisis to get there. But when you're in that crisis, you can learn wisdom and get out of it. And so again, and paraphrasing from the Hebrew scriptures, we're at a crossroads. We can choose death or we can choose life. We can choose death. There's threats out there, disaster capitalism, big corporations just taking advantage of these crises and causing social inequalities, the threats of economic collapse. There's a problem of bundled small business loans out there. They bundled housing loans. They now bundled small business loans. We could have a major collapse. After the last pandemic and the First World War, there was the Roaring '20s, which may have been a good time, but we had a depression right after that binge. There's the threat of authoritarianism. There's threats of increases in surveillance, and with the climate crisis, there's the threat of economic collapse. Or we can choose life, healthier routines, careful planning, care for each other, sharing, support, sustainability, and social justice. So in summary, let's learn from the pandemic so our response to an even greater challenge of the commons might be met. And so that's my presentation. Just want to say that presentations are available. I can come out to groups, not come out to, but I can Zoom into groups and present if you're interested. And now I'm going to turn it back to Aaron, who's going to get to our two very knowledgeable other two speakers, Michael and Matthew. So thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And I just wanted to remind everyone that we will send out the recording of this presentation as well as some of the presentation slides. Those can be made available to you if you would like them. So first, I know that Michael's having just a couple of internet issues, but as long as everything is good, I'll turn it over to Michael to respond to Dan.
Things are good. Thank you very much, Aaron. I'm Michael Black from Georgia State University, and I'm a United Methodist Earthkeeper. And I wanted to highlight something from Luke 10:25-37. When an expert in the law asked Jesus what to do to inherit eternal life, he asked him, what does the law say? Love God and love your neighbor. And I think that those are important points within this. I also think that there's a really important point in that when the expert in the law asked, who is my neighbor? Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan. So love God and love your neighbor, and stories are a critical way of conveying the message that we want to convey. The Bible and Jesus use stories throughout to convey messages and help people to remember them. And stories and relationships are going to be very key to how we do this. One of Dan's points in point 17 was that we listen to people we trust. And getting to know the local cultural experience is very important. I'm going to flip that on its head a little bit too and say the people that listen to you are the people who trust you. And so building trust with people is key to social movements. I want to really reiterate that point that Dan made. Building relationships is what this is all about. And not just within the relationships that we might normally work, but within relationships that we might not normally work. We should be building relationships with people that are not like us. Facebook filters out a lot of stuff that we don't want to see. And so we have to actively work against that to make sure that we are actively seeking out people that don't think like us. And some of this means meeting people where they are. There was a very controversial thing done by a fairly famous preacher in my area called Andy Stanley. He decided that they were not going to open their really large churches until next year at the earliest. But the way he conveyed that message was he included everybody. And I'll quote a little bit and give you a little bit of my thoughts on this. He said, now, one of the things I love about our churches is that we attract all kinds of people of all kinds of persuasion. And so for some of you, this makes perfect sense. And in fact, you may be relieved. I want you to hear that. One of the things I love about our church is that we attract all kinds of people. He starts by encompassing everybody, by bringing in a big umbrella. I love that we disagree about things, that things people say and think are different from what I think. And then he says, for others, this seems like an unnecessary precaution and perhaps a lack of faith on my part. You might even interpret this as through a political filter. And honestly, I get all that. So he acknowledges that there are people that will disagree with him, and he acknowledges where they're coming from. This is saying, I see you, and I acknowledge that that's a valid place that you're coming from. When you do that with people, they lean in. If you accuse them and you tell them they're wrong, then they push away and they use their own ways to justify what their stance is and justify why you might be wrong. They go on the defensive. If you tell them, I value you and I see where you're coming from, and I acknowledge that that is a place that you could be right now, then they lean in and they listen further. He goes on to say, I actually have lots of faith. I have so much faith that I'm absolutely confident that the church and our local churches will not only survive this, but I think ultimately we're going to thrive as a result. Besides, as you've heard me say on many occasions, now he's using the relationship that he's already built. We are the church. And whether we gather in circles, in driveways, in the church parking lot, online, or at home, the church is going to be fine. We are going to continue to be the hands and feet of Jesus in each other's lives, as well in the lives of those that aren't even a part of one of our churches. And I'm confident that I'm confident of that because of you. So now he's vesting things into the people that he's talking to. I'm confident of that because I'm confident in you. And 2,000 years of church history attest to the fact that Jesus is building his church, and we're simply invited to participate in the process. This is validating where people are coming from, yet bringing them to the decision so that they could agree that this is the way to go. Another example comes from my sister's life. My sister works in a retreat center that works with people with mental challenges, some with challenges of addiction. She was in the cafeteria. They have a rule at the retreat that everybody has to wear masks. If you're in the cafeteria and eating, you don't have to, but if you're in the cafeteria and working, you need to wear a mask. And this person was not wearing their mask. They were just working. So she came over to them and she said, you know, we have a rule here. I want to make sure that for the safety of everyone here, that we consistently hold to this rule and wear a mask. And the guy kind of blew her off and he's like it makes a difference. It's really not a big deal, this virus. And instead of calling somebody else to pull in to enforce the rule or yelling at him, my sister showed vulnerability. She said, I understand where you're coming from, but I want to tell you that my grandmother died of COVID. And this is a very personal thing to me. So if you would please wear your mask, that would make a difference for me. because it made a difference in my grandmother's life, and that was very important in terms of my life. And the guy hesitantly put it on and has worn it ever since. Not begrudgingly, but worn it because he feels that vulnerability and that relationship. The last thing I want to leave with is something I heard when I went to an Association for the Advancability in Higher Education, ASHE meeting in 2014. The keynote speaker was Annie Leonard. Some of you may know her from her Story of Stuff. She's also now the head of Greenpeace. And when she was a 20-year-old, Greenpeace needed somebody to go track where waste was going and where it was ending up. And she had no ties, no car, no husband, no kids. She was ready and willing, and she volunteered. And she followed the trail of garbage for almost a decade before she wrote Story of Stuff. And she said when she started this, she realized how many things were wrong and how our planet was being trashed so quickly. And she recognized, this is critical, this is urgent. I need to sprint to the finish to beat this. And she said, after a decade of doing this, I realized this isn't a sprint, and I don't need to sprint. I need to have self-care. I need to build those relationships. I need to build this movement further. I need to make this a marathon. This is a marathon. I've got to run for the long haul in order to beat out all these other forces that are working against us. She ended by saying, but you know what? Now, more than 40 years later, I'm realizing something. This is not a sprint. This is not a marathon. This requires a movement. This is not a marathon. This is a relay race. Here's your baton. And with that, Matthew, here's your baton.
Smooth transition. Thank you, Dr. Black. I really resonate with a lot of what you said. But I'm Matthew Groves. Just again, I'm on the steering committee for Tennessee's chapter of Interfaith Power Light, and I work for a group called Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. And I love what Dr. Black says about loving God and loving neighbor, because that's on all of our t-shirts. It says, love God, love neighbor, act on climate change. So I have just a quick thought or two I wanted to share before we get into the Q&A. And I really like what Dan said about just transition. I also come from coal country. My grandfather spent time in the mines in West Virginia. And a lot of the time, environmentalists sound like we come into a community and we say, your jobs are killing polar bears and you need to stop it, and I'm sorry. And that's the pitch. And that's not a good pitch, right? So I think focusing on just transition, it's the right thing to do to help people transition. And coming from a Christian perspective, we ought to be concerned with people's well-being. But it's also a better narrative. And I think telling people a message that you can help us preserve this earth for your grandchildren and this beautiful nature while getting a good paying union job. I think that's a much better message that we can present to people. So being aware of the narrative we're telling about how it's going to change these towns is important. Another thing, like Dr. Black mentioned, is churches are kind of a sweet spot for both of these crises. For both of these crises have individual components, but also system components. And churches are right at the middle ground where they're big enough to have a huge impact. I mean, just look at COVID. Churches are a lot of the super spreader events that have let this get out of control. But churches are big enough to have a large impact, but small enough that you can make a difference, right? It's hard to change the Tennessee Valley Authority's approach to renewable energy, right? But it's easier to change how your church approaches recycling. That's like, you got to go to a couple meetings and make yourself heard, but that's something you can get done that will amplify your impact beyond just one household. So I think for both COVID and climate change, churches are a really natural place to spend some time in investing, which you're all with United Methodist Earth Keepers program. So you are very aware of that, and I salute you for that. And I will pause there so we can let Aaron take the questions.
Thanks, Matthew and Michael. So just a reminder, we haven't gotten any questions quite yet, but if you have any questions at all, feel free to send them in the chat box. We have a note from Christine Muller who says, there are faith-based curricula for youth on the Story of Stuff website. So go to the resources section of their website.
I also want to highlight one other thing. When I said you should be reaching out to other people and building those relationships, one of the things I love about the United Methodist Church is that we have people of all political values. So your church already has those people that you can build a relationship with, and you've already got a base because they're your church members. So these are the people that you can connect with very easily because you've already got that connection as a church.
So we have a question from Laura Hunt to Matthew. And Laura asks, can you repeat your example of a church being small enough and big enough to make an impact?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. So both of the crises we're talking about are systems problems and individual problems. And individual problems, it's easy to do something about, but the impact isn't nearly as high as if you can affect the entire system. So I live in Nashville, and it's great that I recycle, right? But no amount of recycling I can do would be nearly as helpful as if the city decided to pick up recycling once a week instead of once a month, right? But that's a really hard policy for me to change. Like I could spend years lobbying City Hall, and maybe I could make that happen if I got some people together. But that's a big push for me to get the city to change its approach to recycling. So that's high impact, but really high inertia. City Hall has a lot of inertia on how they handle recycling. Your church, however, it's still a bigger impact than one household, but it's a lot easier to make your church change a policy than to make City Hall change a policy, or especially a bigger group like the Tennessee State House. So churches are kind of in a sweet spot where you're getting a lot more impact than just one household being active, perhaps. But it's easier to make something happen at a church level than at a city level. Is that helpful, Ms. Hunt? Right. Okay.
So we have a comment from Pat. Pat says, I love the focus on the common good, but that's something that I hear very little about these days, even in the church. There is quite a contrast between the common good and the notion that my individual rights are the most important thing, and to hell with everybody else. How can we as a church recover the sense that the common good is more important than my own individual rights?
Let me start with that. First of all, I want to say hello to Pat. Pat and I are both very close friends, and he, I, and Susan Mullen from Minnesota conceived the Earth Keepers program and launched it. And so we work together very closely. Good question, Pat. And I don't have a full answer to that. It's something I struggle with all the time. I think the idea of the commons and the common good is something that we've really neglected in our culture. And it's a long, that neglect has grown over the last 40, 50 years. And I think it's less so than when I was growing up. There was more sense of that, of common purpose. Within our faith traditions, Pat, you've heard me preach before, and I often highlight the idea of the covenant with each other, and the covenant with all creation. because the covenant, I mean, we have responsibility as individuals to be faithful to that covenant, but be faithful to God to that covenant and share with each other. And so there's a lot of sharing in that covenant, and there's a responsibility in that covenant, but that covenant is also, it's a common good. It's a common good as opposed to just a simple individual focus. And so at least when I'm preaching, my rare opportunities to preach, I will often highlight the covenant. And it seems to resonate with people because they are familiar with that concept and could say, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. And so that would be one kind of symbolic biblical resource that I would pull on.
For me, for religious people, and I put this in the chat, I think it's reminding people God's major word: love God and love your neighbor. And to hell with all the others goes against that commandment of God. For non-religious people, I think there's a little of evangelism we can do, not necessarily making them Christians right off the bat, but demonstrating God's grace. Because when people see that other people are doing something that's not in their best interest, that benefits them, they model that. That happens in your kids, that happens in your neighbors. You can do this as a social experiment. We're very social animals. The more we experience people keeping to themselves and being individualistic, the more we tend to do the same. The more we see people smile, the more we smile. The more we see people give graciously and love neighbor, the more we do that. And so one of the best things we can do as Christians is to model that, to take joy in loving our neighbor, so that others see that not only did they give, but they took joy in that giving. What am I missing?
I would just chime in as well. I think Scripture is a great direction to go with Christian audiences, and I know there's a huge individualism streak in the American church in general. But I feel like if you can engage someone in a thoughtful conversation about Scripture, you can break that down just a little bit, because biblical messages are shot through with love of neighbor and how we are all part of a greater whole than ourselves. One of my favorite quick examples of this is the Good Samaritan. And it was Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s analysis on the parable of the Good Samaritan is that the central question, the Samaritan asked that the Pharisee and the Levite didn't ask. The Pharisee and the Levite, they thought, if I help this person, how will it affect me, right? But the Samaritan asked, if I don't help this person, how will it affect them? So asking about other people before your own well-being was Dr. King's takeaway from the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I think that really resonates in today's world. Instead of asking, how inconvenient is it for me to wear a mask? Or how inconvenient is it for me to talk about climate change or what have you? A better question is, what will happen if I don't wear a mask? What could happen if I don't wear a mask? And if I don't, talk to people at my church about climate and things we can do. So I think shifting the question is a good approach for a church audience.
Thanks, y'all. I think we have maybe 2 comments on this question as well. From Laura Hunt. Laura said, if you are truly loving, joy will abound, and you don't have to even think about what you are modeling. And then I believe Mary Beth asked to read something from the Reformed Jewish prayer book on the common good. So I'll invite Mary Beth to read.
Yes, thank you, Erin. It just seems like it's on topic. It's something that shows up pretty much every week in our Friday night service. So, and it always struck me. Standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt, that there is a better place, a promised land. that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get there from here to there, except by joining hands, marching together.
Thank you, Mary Beth. So moving forward, we have a question from Leanne, who asks, what is a good first step for a congregation to take on both of these issues?
I think for me, I think the best step to take is to build those relationships and start to join together in small steps. And churches are doing this, recognizing who are the marginalized that are affected most by these issues and starting to reach out to them and build relationships and recognizing we didn't recognize these people. We missed this. And why was it that it took a crisis for us to acknowledge this? And who are the best partners and what are the best needs that need to be met? I think that's where the local churches should start. And the local churches are the only places that this can be done because those people are right there in the local community.
Thank you, Michael. This is Dan. That's a challenging question. I would say for those traditions that have worship, I would, it's best to, I think, try to do worship, education, and then get to people together to come up with a plan of action. And so that the whole entity, congregation or whatever, is acting together. And so if you get all of that kind of going at the same time, I see kind of the most effective, the most effective. And then the particular action comes out of the congregation. And it can include congregational or house of worship responses, and it can include advocacy. I mean, there's lots of opportunities there. And so just look at what those opportunities are, but try to get all of those, all the pieces of the life of, the group kind of flowing together. I've seen that to kind of be the most effective response when you're able to do that.
I would agree. I think as far as projects go, there's a lot of different things you can do. You can try and tackle recycling. You can try and make a church garden, which does a lot of good things. You can, a church near me has a compost drop-off, which is great for all the young people who live in apartments and want somewhere to put their compost, right? There's a lot of different things you can do, but I would agree with both Dan and Dr. Black that church buy-in is really crucial. And so you got to plow that soil before you can expect anything to grow. And if your pastor's on board, that can come from the pulpit. Sometimes that can work pretty well. Or you could start a Sunday school class, perhaps, to get a larger chunk of your church really invested in issues like this. But getting broader buy-in from the congregation, I would absolutely agree, is a good first place to start.
I would agree. And I would say that a lot of times people target the pastor to do it from the pulpit, which can be somewhat effective, but the real movement, we're in a United Methodist Church, pastors are itinerant. Focusing too much on the staff of the church and not on the membership of the church can work against you, because those people in the pews with you are the people that are going to be there for quite a bit of time, particularly if you build good relationships with them. And those are the ones that you want to continue. And yes, you definitely want to influence your pastor as well, because they're going to go other places too. But if you want to make a change in your local church, the pastor is one place you can go, but not the place to go, which I think Matthew really highlighted when talking about Sunday school groups as well.
Thanks, y'all. We had a comment from Laura Hunt who said, Jesus Christ ministered unto the marginalized. We should continue the same, no different 2,000 years later. And Michael responded, no different 2,000 years from now. And I think our final question this morning comes from Christine, who says, this conversation has been very rich. The Baha'i teachings can continue to help to shift our mindset to embrace all of humankind as our neighbor. The earth is but on country and mankind, its citizens, is a quote. How can we at IPL cultivate a world-embracing vision and adjust global governance? This seems to be important to generate motivation for action, as well as to have coordinated global unified action.
Well, again, it's good to hear from the Baha'i faith. One of my dissertation advisors, Richard Thomas, comes out of that tradition. And so I learned a lot about Baha'i during that time. And there's a rich tradition there. Yeah, we are not in a real good place in this country in terms of our international cooperation. We've gutted off a lot of that. And so I don't have a real good answer to that other than I think it's essential. The Paris Climate Accords, it's essential that we get back in those, I think, for the climate crisis. We're not technically out yet, but that we not leave. And I think that there's a great deal of opportunity for cooperation there. It both addresses the mitigation aspects about the various countries' emissions and cooperation around that, and the need to provide assistance to vulnerable populations around the world and countries that need assistance. And at least parts of the United Nations are also can be very effective in all of this. And so I think that at least parts of the United Nations can be an effective tool in moving forward too. And so that's maybe not the great, again, it's probably a little bit outside of my field of understanding, but I do want to resonate that I think that's essential.
Yeah, that's tough. I feel like if we had good answers for that, we might not be in the problem we are right now. I do just a quick thought or two. I think voting. Yeah, vote for leaders who you think will cooperate with other countries for the good of the future of mankind. I think is a good prescription. And I know the Methodist Church is in a state of turmoil at the moment, but I think in comparison, I grew up Southern Baptist, and I think there aren't too many truly global churches, especially in the Protestant world, right? So I appreciate that the Methodist Church has genuine ties with other regions of the world besides North America, because my Southern Baptist tradition does not at all. So I think that's one opportunity, is connections we have with people from other parts of the world. I think in the Methodist world, it might be a little easier than in some traditions because there are Methodists all over the world. So it's a little bit easier to see us as brothers and sisters from across the globe instead of just my little church here in my little county.
I think Dan and Matthew said it well. I don't have much to add to that.
Thanks, y'all. We have a comment from Anne who says, vote. And then Mary Beth says, amen, Anne. So I think we have come to the limit of our time today together, but I just want to give one last chance for any of our speakers to have any final comments, if any. But if not, I think we are all good. Thank you again for being with us this morning. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your engagement. Just a reminder that we did record this meeting, and so we will be sending the recording out so that you can go back and take notes. You can share with your friends. And we will also include the presentation slides. So thank you to our three presenters, Dan and Matthew and Michael. Sorry, Matthew, for forgetting you at the beginning. This was incredible, and I am thankful for your engagement today. So we'll be in touch with more exciting events in the future, but thank you for being with us today.